A man often searches for the source of his struggles in the shadows outside himself. He imagines that there is a being, a force, a presence that tempts him, deceives him, and pushes him toward failure. He gives it a name, calls it the devil, and paints it as something separate, foreign, and dangerous. Yet when he looks closer, he discovers an unsettling truth. The devil he fears, the voice he imagines as alien, is nothing other than his own mind. The thoughts, doubts, impulses, and desires that he believes are imposed from without are in fact his own. They are familiar because they are his own creation, a reflection of the very consciousness that he inhabits. The mind is a vast and complex landscape, capable of both creation and destruction. Within it, impulses arise, some noble, some base, some fleeting, some persistent. Every thought, every inclination, every moral hesitation begins there. The whisper of envy, the suggestion of indulgence, the quiet urge toward fear or anger, they all originate internally. A man often imagines that these are the voice of an external adversary, and in doing so he distances himself from responsibility. Yet the voice is familiar because it speaks his language, follows his logic, and mirrors his habits. The devil, as imagined, is not a stranger. It is the echo of the self. This is why the devil is so difficult to recognize. A man can easily spot what is alien, loud, or foreign. Threats that roar, that arrive suddenly, or that demand attention are simple to identify and resist. But the mind works differently. Temptation does not always announce itself with grandeur. It is subtle. It suggests rather than commands. It rationalizes rather than coerces, and it whispers in tones so familiar that the listener rarely notices the distinction between impulse and self. A man hears the devil not because it is foreign, but because it sounds like the very voice he carries inside himself every day. The recognition of this truth is both liberating and unsettling. It is unsettling because it removes the comforting notion that failure, weakness, or fear can be blamed on some external force. No longer can the man say, "I was tempted by the devil," or "I could not help myself because of an outside influence." The source is not outside, it is inside. Yet this recognition is liberating because it returns power to the man. The mind that generates temptation also has the capacity for wisdom, reflection, and discipline. The same voice that suggests indulgence, fear, or avoidance can be observed, questioned, and guided toward integrity and virtue. Every man has experienced the moment when an impulse feels inevitable, when a desire seems irresistible, when fear appears to command attention. These moments are not imposed from outside. They are rehearsed within, nurtured in private thought, and given weight by attention and habit. A fleeting suggestion becomes persistent when entertained repeatedly. Rationalizations grow into habits, and habits crystallize into character. The voice of the devil is persistent not because it is external, but because the mind listens, repeats, and gives it authority. Recognition of this internal origin is the first step toward reclaiming mastery. A man often misunderstands familiarity as safety. When an external force speaks in a voice unlike his own, he resists it because it is unfamiliar. Yet the impulses he experiences internally are familiar, so he grants them undue credibility. He trusts what he recognizes, even when it leads him astray. This is why self-deception is so effective. The mind disguises its own suggestions as reason, necessity, or desire, and the man obeys, believing that he is following truth rather than impulse. The devil, in this sense, is effective precisely because it is familiar. It does not sound like a threat. It sounds like the self. Awareness is the tool that allows a man to distinguish between the impulses of the mind and deliberate choice. Observation of thought, practiced without judgment, illuminates the source of temptation. A man notices the recurrent suggestions, the patterns of desire, the subtle rationalizations, and the familiar voice that masquerades as reason. Once these are recognized, the familiar voice loses its power to deceive. It is no longer an external force. It is a reflection to be observed, understood, and, when necessary, guided. Recognition transforms the relationship between impulse and action. and the mind becomes an instrument of insight rather than a source of confusion. The mind's familiarity is also the reason it carries potential for both corruption and mastery. Every suggestion that tempts toward indulgence, fear, or resentment has a counterpart that can be nurtured toward courage, clarity, and discipline. The devil is only dangerous because a man fails to observe, to question, and to choose. The familiar voice, once recognized, can be guided. A man can respond to it consciously, redirecting subtle impulses toward deliberate action, nurturing insight over habit, and intention over automatic reaction. In this way, the very voice that once threatened can become a teacher, a guide, and a mirror reflecting opportunity rather than danger. It is also necessary to understand the role of repetition. The mind speaks continuously, and the familiar voice returns again and again. Repeated thoughts, rehearsed desires, and habitual rationalizations accumulate power. This quiet accumulation often goes unnoticed, which is why the devil feels so persuasive. But repetition also carries potential for transformation. If the mind can rehearse fear or indulgence, it can also rehearse courage, patience, and clarity. The familiar voice, once recognized, can be trained, just as a muscle can be strengthened. Why? For repeated effort. Mastery is cultivated in the repetition of deliberate choice, in the consistent observation of thought, and in the patience to guide familiar impulses toward wisdom. Responsibility is inseparable from this recognition. The familiar voice does not diminish accountability, it magnifies it. When a man understands that temptation, doubt, and desire originate within, he sees that he cannot shift blame to an external adversary. Every lapse, hesitation, and moral misstep arises from patterns he has created or allowed. At first, this realization may feel heavy, but it is also empowering. The same mind that generates temptation also contains the capacity for self-mastery. Responsibility is the doorway to freedom because it places the tools of change firmly in the hands of the one who experiences the struggle. Ultimately, the recognition that the devil sounds like oneself is the foundation of true insight. A man ceases to look outward for blame or explanation. He observes the mind, notices the familiar voice, and understands that every temptation, doubt, or suggestion is an internal event. The whispers that once deceived him become guides for reflection. The impulses that once threatened to control action now illuminate the areas where attention, patience, and deliberate choice are required. By facing the familiar voice honestly, a man discovers that the power to act rightly, to resist weakness, and to cultivate virtue lies not in avoiding external forces, but in mastering the mind that speaks within. And when a man finally sees that the devil is only the echo of his own mind, he stops fearing a stranger, begins listening carefully to himself, and discovers that every whisper he hears is both a challenge and a path toward mastery. A man rarely recognizes the true nature of temptation because it does not arrive with a shout. He imagines that forces seeking to sway him must be loud, obvious, dramatic, demanding immediate attention. Looks for a thunderclap, a forceful push, a clear command from without. Yet the reality of influence is far subtler. The mind works quietly, patiently, and with a cunning that the unobservant cannot detect. It does not shout because shouting would be too obvious. It suggests, it rationalizes, it persuades, and it insinuates itself in the familiar tone of the man's own thoughts. The devil, as imagined, is loud and external, but the true source of persuasion whispers in the language of reason and familiarity, and this is why it is so effective. These whispers are rarely recognized as influence because they are disguised as thought. A fleeting worry, a quiet suspicion, a momentary justification, all appear natural because they are. They come from the mind itself, rehearsed over years of habit and reflection, woven seamlessly into the fabric of perception. When a man hears these suggestions, he assumes they are neutral, inevitable, or even necessary. He rarely questions their origin. They are like water flow, quietly into a cup. By the time he notices, the cup is already full. This subtlety is not weakness in the mind, it is the mind's precision. Influence that cannot be seen, cannot be resisted, The mind's quiet suggestions are persistent because they are familiar. A man is comfortable with his own voice, with his own reasoning, with the patterns of thought he has rehearsed over time. This comfort makes it almost impossible to see the danger. An external command may be resisted because it is strange, unexpected, or jarring. But when the impulse to indulgence, fear, or resentment arises in the familiar tone of one's own thoughts, it passes almost unnoticed. A whisper repeated becomes a habit. A subtle suggestion becomes a belief, and the mind slowly but relentlessly bends perception and action toward patterns that were once invisible. Rationalization is the tool the mind uses to make these whispers persuasive. A man hears, "It's not so bad, everyone does it," or "I deserve this," and the suggestion passes as reason. These rationalizations are subtle. They do not demand obedience. They merely appear as logical, natural, and justifiable. The mind constructs arguments for indulgence, fear, or avoidance with elegance, convincing the man that the suggestion is neutral or even necessary. Because the voice sounds like his own, he trusts it, and in trusting it, he surrenders control without ever realizing he has done so. The danger of such subtlety is that influence is cumulative. No single suggestion is fatal. A fleeting thought of doubt, a moment of indulgence, a quiet impulse toward fear may pass unnoticed, appearing insignificant in isolation. Yet each suggestion that is entertained, each impulse that is unexamined, strengthens a pattern of thought. Over time, repeated whispers build a network of influence that shapes perception, choice, and behavior. By the time a man recognizes the consequences, the architecture of habit has already been constructed. What once seemed like sudden temptation was actually the culmination of countless quiet suggestions. Subtle influence also explains why men often feel powerless in moments of struggle. They perceive temptation as sudden and external, imagining that it strikes with force. They do not realize that the moment of weakness is not an imposition from outside, but the natural unfolding of patterns already present in thought. The mind has rehearsed the impulse, nurtured the doubt, and rationalized the desire long before it manifests in action. What feels unavoidable is often the result of familiarity, repetition, and subtle persuasion. Recognizing this truth is essential because it reveals that the power to resist is always present. It only requires observation and conscious engagement. Awareness is the antidote to subtle persuasion. A man who practices careful attention to thought notices the whispers as they arise. He recognizes the impulses to fear, indulge, or resent, and observes them without immediate reaction. This observation is not judgment, it is clarity. By witnessing the subtle suggestions before they accumulate into habitual action, the man creates space between impulse and choice. This space is where freedom resides, where deliberate action becomes possible, and where the mind ceases to be a quiet manipulator and becomes a conscious partner. The mind's subtle influence is also a teacher. If a man pays attention, he notices the patterns of suggestion and the circumstances in which they arise. He sees how fear grows in anticipation, how desire escalates when indulged in imagination, how resentment takes root in repeated reflection. These observations illuminate the architecture of thought, revealing how easily influence can shape perception and action. Once seen, these patterns can be redirected. The very whisper that once led to weakness can now signal opportunity for reflection, self-discipline, and deliberate action. Discipline and patience are necessary companions. And mastering subtle influence. The mind's quiet suggestions do not disappear overnight. Habits of thought are reinforced over years, and subtle impulses continue to arise as long as they are unobserved. Yet each act of attention, each conscious choice, each moment of reflection strengthens the capacity to resist and redirect. Subtle persuasion is not eliminated, it is guided. Over time, the whispers that once seemed inevitable become manageable, and the mind begins to produce deliberate, intentional, and virtuous influence rather than unnoticed sway. The mind's subtlety also teaches humility. A man realizes that he has been influenced in ways that were almost invisible. He recognizes that weakness, indulgence, or fear often arises not from external forces, but from patterns within himself that he failed to observe. This recognition is humbling because it exposes the mind's quiet power over action. Yet humility is paired with empowerment. The same subtle voice that can mislead can also be guided. The man learns that the responsibility for thought and action is entirely his, and with that recognition comes the capacity for conscious mastery. Subtle influence is also the reason that internal reflection is more powerful than external blame. A man who searches for devils, external forces, or misfortune to explain failure misses the true source of temptation. The mind's quiet persuasions have already shaped thought and action. By observing, reflecting, and directing internal influence, hence, the man gains a level of control that external intervention could never provide. The devil is ineffective. Mastery is internal. Recognition of subtlety transforms struggle into opportunity, and repeated awareness transforms impulse into deliberate action. Ultimately, the quiet persuasion of the mind reveals a profound truth. Temptation is not a stranger. Failure is not imposed, and moral struggle does not originate in an external adversary. It originates within, in the subtle voice that sounds like the self. To live with wisdom, courage, and integrity, a man must recognize this voice, observe it carefully, and guide it deliberately. The whispers that once shaped action unconsciously can now illuminate insight, discipline, and freedom. And when a man finally understands that the devil persuades not with shouts, but with familiar whispers, he no longer fears loud enemies, ignores subtle guidance at his peril, and learns to listen carefully to the quiet voice within, for it is both the source of temptation and the key to mastery. A man often believes that deception, temptation, and moral weakness come from forces outside himself, from something foreign, sinister, or deliberately opposed to his will. He imagines a devil, a being whose purpose is to mislead, to corrupt, and to dominate. He fears this entity because he believes it is separate, alien, and powerful. Yet the reality is far simpler and far more profound. The greatest deception a man experiences is created by himself. The mind, in its quiet, persistent way, disguises impulses, desires, fears, and rationalizations as reason. What he perceives as external manipulation, what he attributes to a devil or to misfortune, is often nothing more than self-deception, the mind convincing itself of necessity, inevitability, or justification. Self-deception is subtle because it speaks in the familiar tone of logic. A man hears a suggestion, a rationalization, or a justification, and it feels natural, necessary, and inevitable. "It's not so bad," the mind whispers. "Everyone does it," it reassures. "I deserve this," it argues. In these moments, the mind is not forcing obedience, it is persuading, guiding, and normalizing impulses so that they appear reasonable. The danger lies not in coercion, but in the quiet, convincing manner with which the mind masks indulgence, fear, or resentment as rational thought. The devil sounds familiar because it is composed of the same patterns, habits, and tendencies that a man rehearses daily in thought. What makes self-deception so powerful is that it operates largely without notice. A man is rarely conscious of the repeated mental rehearsals, the quiet justifications, and the habitual rationalizations that shape behavior over time. Impulses are nurtured in private, fears are reinforced in imagination, and indulgences are repeated internally, long before they manifest externally. By the time a man recognizes the consequences, patterns have already solidified. Ions appear inevitable, impulses feel irresistible, and temptation seems to arrive from outside. Yet every step of the path was paved internally, and the whispers of self-deception guided each decision. The mind's ability to rationalize is an essential part of this process. It is rare for a thought to appear as a blatant demand, "Do this wrong," or "fear this without reason." More often, rationalization reframes, reinterprets, and reshapes impulses to make them appear necessary, acceptable, or unavoidable. A man convinces himself that indulgence is deserved, that fear is justified, that resentment is reasonable. The mind does not shout or coerce. It persuades. It presents choice in such a way that surrender feels like rational compliance, and the familiar voice of thought becomes a subtle accomplice to moral compromise. Self-deception is cumulative. One small rationalization or indulgence may seem insignificant, a fleeting thought without consequence, yet the repetition of these moments forms a pattern that grows stronger over time. A mind that consistently justifies minor weaknesses or fears eventually produces habits, and habits crystallize into behavior. By the time a man confronts the result, a moral lapse, a missed opportunity, a moment of weakness, the root has long been established. He feels as though he has been overtaken by an external force, unaware that the internal work of persuasion has already taken place. Recognition of this cumulative effect is the first step toward interrupting the cycle. The familiarity of self-deception is also what makes it so dangerous. A man is comfortable with his own reasoning. He trusts the voice that has spoken to him throughout his life. When an impulse arises in that voice, it is given credibility, even if it leads to indulgence, fear, or resentment. Strange or alien commands are resisted because they are unfamiliar, but the internal familiar voice is trusted, rehearsed, and obeyed without scrutiny. Self-deception thrives in the comfort of familiarity, disguising error as necessity, weakness as normalcy, and impulse as reason. Awareness is the antidote. A man must cultivate the ability to observe his own mind without judgment, noticing rationalizations, habitual patterns, and the familiar voice that often misleads. He must recognize the difference between thought that serves insight and growth, and thought that masks indulgence, fear, or avoidance. Observation allows him to intercept the subtle arguments before they shape perception or behavior. It transforms the familiar voice from an invisible manipulator into a conscious instrument, guiding choices rather than directing them unconsciously. Reflection enhances this awareness. The mind's patterns are often invisible until they are examined over time. By reflecting on choices, impulses, and responses, a man can uncover the recurrent rationalizations and justifications that shape his actions. He begins to see the subtle ways in which the mind creates the illusion of necessity, the ways in which it disguises impulse as reason, and the familiar voice that quietly persuades. Reflection turns observation into insight, and insight into deliberate action. The mind, once a source of deception, becomes a field for conscious engagement. Deliberate choice is the practice that counters self-deception. Once a man recognizes the familiar voice and observes its patterns, he can decide whether to follow, redirect, or ignore each suggestion. Every impulse toward indulgence, every rehearsal of fear, every whisper of resentment can be acknowledged without being obeyed. The act of deliberate choice strengthens the mind's capacity to distinguish between rationalization and reason, between impulse and intention. Over time, the familiar voice loses its power to deceive, and the mind becomes a partner in conscious, deliberate action. Self-deception is not inherently malevolent. The mechanisms that mask error can also guide insight. The same capacity for rationalization that can justify indulgence can also justify courage, patience, and integrity. The familiar voice, once recognized, can be trained. The impulses that once misled can be examined, understood, and directed. In this way, self-deception becomes a mirror, revealing both vulnerability and potential. A man who understands this principle no longer fears his own mind. He engages it consciously, shaping its influence rather than surrendering to it unconsciously. Patience is essential. In this engagement, the mind has been shaped over years by repetition and habit, and subtle rationalizations cannot be undone instantly. Each act of observation, reflection, and deliberate choice strengthens the mind's capacity for conscious guidance, gradually transforming the familiar voice from a source of deception into a source of insight. The process is slow, often imperceptible but persistent attention and engagement, yield lasting change. Humility is also cultivated through recognition of self-deception. A man sees how easily his mind has misled him, how subtly impulses have been guided, and how powerfully rationalization can shape action. This awareness humbles him, for he realizes the quiet influence he has surrendered to unknowingly. Yet this humility is paired with empowerment. The mind that deceived also provides the tools for mastery. Observation, reflection, and deliberate choice transform self-deception from a threat into an opportunity for growth. Ultimately, the realization that self-deception is the source of what a man often calls temptation or external corruption is liberating. It returns responsibility and power to the individual. The familiar voice that once misled is now recognized, observed, and guided. Every impulse, every rationalization, every subtle persuasion becomes an opportunity for deliberate action, insight, and moral mastery. The imagined devil, external and separate, disappears, leaving only the mind itself, and with it the capacity for conscious choice. And when a man finally understands that, the greatest manipulator is not a devil outside, but the familiar voice inside, he stops blaming imagined forces, begins listening carefully to his own thoughts, and discovers that every rationalization, every whisper of desire, every internal suggestion is a chance to act with awareness, integrity, and wisdom. A man walks through life hearing countless voices, yet the one that shapes him most is the quietest and most familiar, his own. The mind speaks in whispers, suggesting, guiding, and persuading, and it is only when a man learns to listen carefully that he can truly discern the source of his impulses. Awareness is the hearing aid that allows him to detect these subtle influences before they grow into habits, before the whispers accumulate into patterns that control his actions. Without awareness, the mind operates almost unconsciously, and the man believes he is acting freely, when in reality he is following a path mapped by unobserved thought. To cultivate awareness is not a simple task. The mind is restless, continuously generating thoughts, desires, fears, and reflections. Some are fleeting, almost imperceptible. Others are persistent, returning again and again to shape perception. Awareness requires a patient and deliberate attention, a willingness to notice these thoughts without immediately reacting. Observation without judgment is the first step. A man must see the impulses for what they are, not label the M as good or bad, not resist them impulsively, but simply notice their presence. The moment a thought is observed, it loses some of its unconscious power, for the mind cannot manipulate what has been seen clearly. Subtlety is the key challenge. The mind rarely shouts, it whispers. It does not demand, it persuades. It does not coerce, it rationalizes. The quiet nature of these whispers makes them difficult to detect, because they sound like the man himself. The impulse to indulge, the suggestion of fear, the rehearsal of resentment, each is presented in familiar tones using familiar logic, echoing the reasoning that the man has long trusted. Without awareness, these whispers are obeyed unconsciously, accumulating influence over choice and action before the man even recognizes them. Awareness allows him to step back, to observe the familiar voice without surrendering to it. Observation alone is not enough. The mind is subtle and persistent, and patterns often remain hidden without careful attention. Reflection complements awareness by illuminating recurring themes, habitual rationalizations, and the context in which impulses arise. A man reflects on moments when fear dictated action, when indulgence seemed necessary, or when resentment subtly influenced his behavior. Through reflection, he traces the origins of these patterns, connecting the whispers to their root in thought. The familiar voice that once seemed natural now becomes visible as influence, and in seeing it, the man gains the ability to choose differently. The cultivation of awareness also transforms fear. A man may initially fear the impulses he notices, believing that the thoughts themselves are dangerous or uncontrollable. Yet awareness teaches him that recognition is power. By noticing the suggestion of indulgence before it becomes action, the urge to fear before it dictates reaction, or resentment before it hardens into habit, the man gains control over influence. Awareness is not a shield from thought, but a tool for mastery, allowing him to engage with his mind consciously rather than surrendering to unconscious persuasion. Attention is the mechanism by which awareness exerts its influence. The mind is shaped by what is given focus. Impulses that are observed without indulgence lose power. Desires that are noticed without attachment fade. Fears that are reflected upon without amplification diminish. A man directs attention deliberately, noticing thought as it arises, and in doing so, he strengthens his capacity for discernment. The same mind that produces temptation can also produce insight, clarity, and deliberate action, but only when attention is consciously applied. Patience is essential because the mind has been shaped over years. Subtle patterns do not disappear with a single act of awareness. The voice that has guided thought and action for decades continues to whisper. Yet each moment of conscious observation, each instance of attention to thought accumulates. Slow. While the mind begins to yield, habits weaken, and impulses lose their unconscious power. Awareness is a long practice, a continuous engagement with the familiar voice, and the results are profound because they are internal, permanent, and self-directed. Self-compassion is another critical component. As a man observes his mind, he notices impulses he may judge as weakness, desires he may feel ashamed of, or fears that he may wish were absent. Awareness without compassion can lead to judgment, guilt, and despair, which only feed the patterns the man seeks to master. Instead, he observes with kindness, acknowledging the presence of these thoughts without surrendering to them. Compassion allows awareness to be sustained, patience to be exercised, and reflection to deepen, creating a fertile ground for mastery. Awareness also sharpens moral and practical judgment. By noticing the mind's subtle suggestions, a man begins to distinguish between thought that serves insight and thought that serves impulse. The familiar voice can suggest both danger and guidance, weakness and opportunity. Observation reveals the difference. The same whisper that once led to indulgence may be harnessed to guide deliberate action. The same urge that once led to fear may be transformed into caution, preparation, and courage. Awareness illuminates the pathways of influence, giving the man choice where he once felt helpless. Repeated observation leads to discernment. The mind produces countless thoughts day, but not all carry influence. Awareness teaches a man to identify which thoughts are significant, which patterns are recurring, and which suggestions are subtle manipulations disguised as reason. He begins to notice the difference between fleeting impulse and persistent rationalization, between natural desire and habitual indulgence. Discernment emerges from continuous awareness, and with it comes the capacity to intervene thoughtfully in the course of one's own mind. Ultimately, awareness is the foundation of freedom. The whispers that once dictated action, that seemed inevitable or external, are seen clearly as internal patterns. The man who listens carefully, who observes without judgment, and who reflects on recurring impulses discovers that power has always resided within. External blame loses its appeal, imagined devils fade in significance, and the voice that was once subtle manipulation becomes a tool for insight, discipline, and conscious choice. Through awareness, the familiar voice is transformed from a master into an ally. And when a man finally cultivates the practice of awareness, he stops being deceived by the quiet suggestions that sound like himself. He begins to observe the mind with patience and discernment, and he discovers that every whisper is both a signal and a choice, a chance to act consciously, wisely, and with true freedom. A man cannot escape the influence of his own mind, but he can choose how he responds to it. Responsibility begins the moment he recognizes that every thought, every whisper of fear or desire, every subtle suggestion that he once believed came from outside, is in fact his own. The familiar voice that whispers indulgence, fear, or resentment is not a stranger. It is the self speaking. And with this recognition comes the profound truth: no one else can govern his mind and no one else can bear the consequences of his choices. Responsibility is not punishment, it is freedom, because it places the power to shape life squarely in his own hands. To take responsibility, a man must first acknowledge ownership of his thoughts. This is more than a passing admission. It is a deep recognition that the impulses he feels, the rationalizations he rehearses, and the fears that arise are his own creation. A man may be tempted to blame circumstance, other people, or imagined devils for the missteps he encounters, but such excuses are a denial of agency. Ownership requires honesty. The impulses are familiar because they are his own. They arise in his mind and they shape his perception, judgment, and action. To deny this is to deny the very mechanism by which change and mastery are possible. Once ownership is acknowledged, responsibility demands active engagement. A man does not merely observe the familiar voice and say, "This is mine." Observation alone is not enough. He must also respond deliberately. Every impulse that arises is an opportunity to exercise conscious choice. When desire tempts, he can notice without surrendering. When fear whispers, he can reflect rather than react. When resentment grows, he can examine and redirect. The act of responding rather than reacting strengthens the mind's capacity to govern itself, transforming the familiar voice from a source of temptation into a tool of deliberate guidance. Responsibility also requires patience. The mind has been conditioned over years, shaped by repetition, habit, and reinforcement. Impulses that once seemed irresistible are not removed instantly by recognition alone. Each act of deliberate choice, each moment of reflection, each exercise of attention chips away at the unconscious authority of these patterns. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the mind becomes more responsive to conscious direction, and the familiar voice, once unobserved, becomes a partner in thoughtful action. Responsibility is the long work of alignment between impulse and intention, and its rewards are internal, profound, and lasting. Self-compassion accompanies responsibility. A man who confronts the familiar voice may notice impulses and desires he judges as weakness, fears that feel shameful, or habits that he wishes were absent. Awareness without compassion leads to guilt, harsh judgment, and despair, which only reinforce the patterns he seeks to master. Responsibility is not self-condemnation, it is recognition and care. A man acknowledges the presence of these thoughts, accepts that they are his, and continues to guide them with patience and deliberation. Compassion transforms ownership from a burden into a practice of self-mastery. The familiar voice also teaches discernment. Once a man accepts responsibility for his thoughts, he begins to see which impulses serve insight and which serve indulgence, which suggestions guide toward growth and which reinforce weakness. The mind, once observed without judgment, becomes a mirror reflecting patterns that were invisible before. Each impulse is examined, each whisper understood, and each choice consciously made. Through this process, the man distinguishes the voice of reason from the voice of rationalization, the voice of courage from the voice of fear, the voice of insight from the voice of habit. Responsibility sharpens perception and cultivates moral clarity. Repeated engagement with the familiar voice strengthens internal authority. Every time a man notices a subtle suggestion and acts deliberately rather than reacting unconsciously, he exercises governance over his own mind. Each moment of responsible choice is like building a muscle. The more it is used, the stronger it becomes. Over time, the capacity to recognize, interpret, and guide the mind's whispers becomes instinctive, yet it is always conscious. Responsibility is not a single act, it is a continuous practice, a lifelong engagement with the self, and the reward is mastery over thought, rather than subjection to it. Responsibility also transforms perception of external forces. Once a man understands that the whispers of the mind are his own, he no longer attributes power to imagined devils, manipulative others, or circumstance. The world continues to present challenges, fears, and desires, but they no longer dominate. The familiar voice, once unexamined, has been observed and guided, and external influence can only have the effect that he permits. Recognition of ownership grants sovereignty over perception. No longer is he a passive recipient of suggestion, he is an active participant in his own life. The practice of responsibility illuminates the path of moral and practical mastery. A man sees that ethical action, self-discipline, and clarity of thought are not imposed by rules outside him, but arise from deliberate engagement with the mind itself. Every moral choice, every act of restraint, every disciplined response is an exercise of responsibility. By claiming ownership of thought and guiding the familiar voice consciously, the man converts what once threatened as weakness into a source of strength, insight, and guidance. Responsibility transforms internal struggle into opportunity. Reflection strengthens responsibility further. A man examines his patterns over time, noticing moments when the familiar voice guided him well and moments when it misled. He traces the consequences of choices, understanding how unobserved impulses once shaped action, and how deliberate engagement now redirects them. Reflection is the practice of learning from oneself, of observing consequences without external blame, and of refining the capacity for conscious choice. It completes the cycle of responsibility, turning ownership into wisdom and observation into deliberate mastery. The familiar voice, once guided responsibly, becomes an ally rather than a threat. What once whispered temptation now signals opportunity for insight. What once encouraged fear now points to areas requiring courage. What once suggested indulgence now provides a mirror to examine desire and redirect it toward purpose. The mind, observed and guided, shifts from a source of subtle manipulation into a partner in conscious, deliberate living. Responsibility is the instrument that converts inner whispers into clarity, integrity, and freedom. Ultimately, the recognition that responsibility lies in acknowledging the familiar voice is transformative. A man who accepts that the impulses, fears, and desires he hears are his own stops seeking external scapegoats, stops blaming imagined devils, and begins guiding the mind with awareness, patience, and compassion. The subtle suggestions that once deceived him are now understood, examined, and directed. Ownership becomes mastery, and responsibility becomes freedom. And when a man finally realizes that moral and personal authority begins by recognizing the voice within, he stops searching for blame outside himself. He listens carefully to his own thoughts, and he discovers that every whisper is a chance to act deliberately, wisely, and with integrity. A man who has spent his life chasing external explanations for temptation, failure, or moral struggle eventually comes to a quiet but profound truth. The mind, familiar and persistent, is both the source of challenge and the key to mastery. Once the whispers of fear, desire, and doubt are recognized, once responsibility for thought is embraced, the familiar voice that once threatened now becomes an instrument to guide life with clarity, courage, and purpose. Mastery transforms the voice that once deceived into a partner in conscious, deliberate living, revealing that what once tempted can now teach, and what once misled can now illuminate. The transformation begins with recognition. A man who notices the subtle patterns of thought, the impulses toward indulgence, the rehearsals of fear, the rationalizations of resentment, begins to see them not as external forces, but as familiar signals arising within his own mind. Recognition alone is powerful because it interrupts the unconscious influence that once shaped action. The whispers that seemed irresistible lose some of their grip the moment they are observed. The familiar voice, once subtle manipulation, becomes an opportunity to understand the workings of the mind, to trace the path from thought to action, and to identify the points where deliberate choice can intervene. Observation must then be coupled with guidance. Awareness alone does not redirect impulse, it only illuminates it. A man must consciously decide how to respond to the familiar voice, examining the suggestion of indulgence, fear, or resentment, and choosing whether to follow, redirect, or release it. Each deliberate response is an exercise of internal authority, a demonstration that the mind is not a passive source of temptation but a partner in shaping life. The whispers that once dictated behavior become indicators for reflection, rehearsal, and intentional action. teaching the man how to navigate both his inner and outer worlds with precision. Patience is essential in this process. The mind has been shaped over years, reinforced by repetition and habit, and the familiar voice will not yield its influence instantly. Impulses that once seemed irresistible continue to arise, and old patterns persist even as awareness grows. Yet every act of conscious engagement weakens unconscious control, strengthens discernment, and cultivates mastery. The familiar voice, when approached with attention and patience, gradually shifts from a source of subtle coercion to a source of guidance. The man who persists in observation and deliberate choice builds a mind capable of responding thoughtfully, with integrity, to both internal impulses and external circumstances. Self-compassion enhances mastery. The process of transforming the familiar voice is not without difficulty. A man notices desires, fears, and tendencies that he once ignored or denied, and the recognition of these impulses can bring discomfort. Compassion allows him to meet the mind with patience, to accept the presence of these thoughts without judgment, and to continue guiding them without surrendering to guilt or shame. Mastery is not the eradication of impulses, but their conscious engagement. The familiar voice is neither enemy nor friend, but a partner to be understood, directed, and refined. Repetition solidifies the transformation. Every conscious choice, every deliberate response to subtle suggestion, strengthens the mind's capacity to guide itself. Habits that once formed unconsciously can now be reshaped intentionally. Impulses toward fear can be tempered with courage. Desires toward indulgence can be balanced with purpose, and rationalizations of weakness can be replaced with clarity. The familiar voice, once a subtle manipulator, becomes a mirror reflecting areas for reflection, practice, and growth. Mastery is cultivated in these repeated, conscious engagements with thought, in the careful rehearsal of response rather than reaction. Through mastery, the mind becomes both teacher and ally. The same impulses that once misled now provide insight. Fear signals where courage is needed. Desire reveals areas for discipline. Doubt illuminates moments requiring clarity. The familiar voice, once a source of subtle temptation, becomes a guide, offering information about the patterns, tendencies, and habits of the mind. The man who listens carefully, reflects, and responds consciously discovers that the whispers of the mind can teach as much as they once tempted, and that internal struggle is not a burden to endure, but a landscape to navigate deliberately. Mastery also reshapes perception of external influence. A man who understands, observes, and guides the familiar voice no longer attributes power to imagined devils, manipulative others, or circumstances beyond his control. Challenges still arise, temptations still appear, and fear still whispers, but the influence of these external events is filtered through a mind that has learned to respond rather than react. The familiar voice, once unnoticed, has been transformed into a tool of discernment. External forces remain, but they no longer dominate. Freedom is not found in the absence of challenge, but in the conscious management of the mind that interprets and responds to it. The cultivation of mastery requires reflection. A man examines his responses, observes the evolution of patterns over time, and recognizes the ways in which deliberate engagement with the familiar voice strengthens discernment, insight, and moral clarity. Reflection reveals both progress and persistence, showing where the mind has been guided successfully and where old patterns continue to surface. This continuous engagement ensures that mastery is not static. It is an ongoing dynamic practice that deepens over time. Each observation, reflection, and conscious choice strengthens the mind's capacity to transform subtle persuasion into deliberate action. Deliberate action, guided by the familiar voice, produces a profound sense of empowerment. A man who masters the whispers of his mind no longer feels at the mercy of impulses or imagined devils. Every choice, every reflection, every deliberate response is a demonstration that influence resides within, not outside. The familiar voice, once a source of temptation and subtle deception, has been reshaped into an instrument of insight, discipline, and guidance. Mastery is not the silencing of the mind, but its conscious direction, a partnership in which every whisper offers information, opportunity, and a path toward intentional living. The transformation of the familiar voice also teaches humility. A man sees how easily he was misled, how subtle influence once guided action without his notice, and he recognizes the quiet power of thought. Yet this humility is paired with empowerment. The same mind that once deceived him now offers guidance, insight, and direction. Mastery is not a claim of perfection, but a demonstration of engagement, attention, and deliberate choice. The familiar voice is neither feared nor ignored. It is listened to carefully, understood deeply, and guided intentionally. Ultimately, mastery reveals a profound freedom. The familiar voice, once a source of temptation, becomes a teacher. Impulses that once misled now illuminate opportunity for growth. The mind, once viewed as a battlefield of struggle, is recognized as a landscape of conscious choice. The man who achieves this understanding no longer fears the whispers that sound like himself. He observes them, he guides them, and he transforms their influence into deliberate action, insight, and moral clarity. Every thought, every impulse, every subtle suggestion becomes a tool for wisdom, courage, and purposeful living. When a man finally masters the familiar voice of his own mind, he stops fearing the whispers that once threatened. He begins listening carefully to what they reveal, and he discovers that the mind that once tempted him is the very instrument through which freedom, clarity, and mastery are achieved.